And welcome to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. You know, are Canadian taxpayers still a force to be reckoned with when it comes to federal politicians and federal policies? You know, there are new taxes such as the carbon tax, and there's spending on dubious items such as SNC-Lavalin and the PM's Security Council tour of Africa. And so accountability and transparency on behalf of the taxpayer seems like a quaint notion of yesteryear. It wasn't always that way. Debt and deficits used to be something voters and therefore politicians took seriously. When I was president of the Treasury, I initiated something called the Deficit Reduction Action Plan, which looked at 650 different programs, along with my colleague Joe Oliver, to ensure that we were spending the right way. Joining me today is Mr. Aaron Wudrick, Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, to discuss the state of government accountability and fairness for taxpayers. I'm going to start with a broad question for you. What is the state of accountability to the taxpayer in Canada today?
Well, it can be pretty bad in some places, Tony. There's, we have access to information laws, but a lot of times you can't get anything out of them. They're supposed to keep people informed about what governments are up to, but I can tell you as a frequent user of them, it's often like, it is impossible to get any information out of government.
Now, having been a political actor myself and a political observer for longer than that, I've noticed how things are actually getting worse. That accountability to the taxpayer actually is getting worse than it was 10 years ago or maybe even 20 years ago. Why do you think that the federal government and federal politicians tend to ignore taxpayer interests when deciding on tax and other policies?
Yeah, I think partly because they can get away with it. These are things that are a little abstract to a lot of Canadians. They don't know a lot about our access to information laws. One good thing is that the number of people asking questions is going up. Part of the reason that these laws don't work well is that there's so many people asking questions that the system is under stress. So there aren't enough resources to answer them all. But beyond that, a lot of the time you'll ask questions and the information you get back is redacted, carved out, exempted. So it's really hard to get a picture of what's going on inside of government.
Now, your organization has advocated for taxpayers for many decades now. Can you just give us a bit of a rundown on how the Canadian Taxpayer Federation does advocate for taxpayers?
Sure. We have three main areas of our advocacy. We support lower taxes. We also support less government waste. So we like to identify things we think government is spending money on poorly and to advocate to reduce those things. And then thirdly is transparency and accountability. We think that at the end of the day, government should be accountable to citizens, and any mechanisms that help empower individuals are things that we're going to be in favor of.
Now, we've seen a lot of change in technology. Obviously, you were referencing the access to information, but there's another side of technology that has changed political lives and economic lives and social lives, and that's the rise of social media. Has that changed how you do your job as well?
Certainly, in terms of reaching people, it's dramatically changed what we do. We used to be strictly, TV and newspaper, and now, of course, you have Facebook, you have Twitter, you have a whole other way to get messages out there. And I think it's a double-edged sword. I think, as a former politician, you'll appreciate yourself. It's a good platform, but it's also, it comes with there's a lot of criticism, there's a lot of angry people out there, and so it does cut both ways.
I've noticed, of course, politicians are trying to leverage social media, and sometimes it creates unintended consequences. I remember when Kathleen McKenna was environment minister, and she took along with her for the Paris negotiations on greenhouse gas emissions a whole social media team. I believe the Canadian Taxpayer Federation looked askance at that. So you're right, it can cut both ways, right?
Oh, absolutely. And it becomes a question of resources, right? Sometimes we've found that large sums of money are being spent on things like vetting a single tweet. That's outrageous for most people. Social media, I think, works best when it's authentic and spontaneous. And when you have essentially, bureaucratically managed social media, you both undermine the message itself and end up wasting taxpayer resources on it.
We're talking to Aaron Wudrick, who is the Executive Director of the Canadian Taxpayer Federation. Aaron, we're going to take a brief break and we'll be right back. Thank you. And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. We have Aaron Wudrick with us, who is the director of the Canadian Taxpayer Federation. Aaron, I was going to talk a little bit about the next Liberal budget that is coming down the pipeline here. And we've heard talk that the Liberal budget will be focusing on personal happiness rather than economic growth and jobs. I'd love to know your thoughts on this, this personal happiness index that they're working on.
Yeah, it does seem a little bizarre. I mean, I suppose I can't blame this as a government that has backed away from most of its own fiscal goals. So if this is just another attempt to distract from the fact that they're not hitting their own targets, I think that would be unfortunate. Look, there's nothing wrong with expanding the scope of what government considers. They did this, for example, with the gender-based analysis, but it's not a substitute for hard fiscal analysis. So I certainly hope the government is not thinking of abandoning things like measuring unemployment, balanced budgets, GDP growth. Those are still important metrics to have.
Does the Canadian Taxpayer Federation, do you make an annual submission on the budget every year?
We often do, not every year. Unfortunately, in some cases, it doesn't change from year to year if the government's not listening to us, so there's not much need. But right now, the biggest focus for us is definitely the concern about the deficit. People recall this government promised to balance the budget. They came nowhere near it. And they are promising to spend lots again now. And I just find it a little bit odd. Even those who are in favor of deficit spending, sometimes it's usually when the economy is in the toilet. Right now, the economy has been doing well, yet we're still running deficits. So I think it's very hard to justify the amount of debt that this government is saddling on the backs of future generations.
I think you raise a good point, and I think part of the issue is that interest rates are so low, there's no real penalty for higher and higher deficits. Of course, you know and I know that interest rates won't be low forever. There'll be a time when the cycle goes the other way. Is that one of your concerns as well?
It absolutely is. I mean, people say it's a good time to borrow, but it's also a good time to pay back because it's cheaper to do it now. And if people say, well, wouldn't you like to take out a mortgage on a house when interest rates are low? Well, maybe if you don't have any mortgages already, if you have a lot of mortgages, which this government does, maybe it's not the time to take on more.
Aaron Wudrick of the Canadian Taxpayer Federation. We've got a new minister, a minister of the middle class. Tell us a little bit about that and your reaction to that new ministerial portfolio.
Well, it's a bit of political buzzwords gone overboard, right? Everyone's in favor of the vaunted middle class. No one can define it. The minister herself cannot define it. So I find it a little bit odd to have a minister in charge of a portfolio where we won't even be able to measure whether or not she's doing her job by helping the middle class.
Yeah, how do you measure? I guess one of the issues is the minister was asked, what is the middle class, and really didn't have an answer. Is that part of the issue here? No one, or at least no one in the government, knows what middle class means or how to measure success?
Yeah, I think politically when the term is used, it's a self-reference for people. It sounds good because most Canadians think they're middle class, whether or not on a scale, in terms of incomes, they're in a specific set of, percentiles in there. That's not clear, but, it's deliberate, I think. There's no way the government wants to pin itself down because then it would be easy to measure whether or not they're succeeding. And, it's always easier when you can avoid accountability.
And that's one of your key measures, is you want to increase accountability of government, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. I think it's fair. Look, different politicians will make different promises, but the least they should do is be able to be measured against what they've said. We're not going to hold them to any other standard than their own. If they're not even willing to do that, I think that, taxpayers and voters should be very skeptical.
Speaking with Aaron Wudrick, who is the Executive Director of the Canadian Taxpayer Federation. Aaron, we're going to go to a break. We'll come right back. Stay with us.
They added almost $100 billion of new debt. They ground economic growth to 0.3%. They shut down $150 billion worth of projects, all before the coronavirus problem even began. How could they have left common sense behind and made us so weak and vulnerable?
If you look at the record, while he was sitting around the cabinet table in the previous government, they added $150 billion to our nation's debt and had the lowest rate of economic growth since the Great Depression.
I'm glad that he brought up our record, because in the first 2 years after we took office, we did what his grandfather would have done. We paid off $40 billion of debt to prepare for the crisis that we knew would one day come. And as a result, we had a buffer. We were prepared, and we had the strongest economy in the G7.
We're here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. We have Aaron Wudrick with us of the Canadian Taxpayer Federation. Aaron, thank you again for being on the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
Want to talk a little bit about corporate welfare. I know that's something the Canadian Taxpayer Federation cares a lot about. How do we get Canadian business weaned off corporate welfare?
There's no question it's a challenge. And in fact, you can't blame business for it because governments in this country have been doing it for so long that they're almost used to it. And in fact, they've created a situation where a lot of businesses don't understand a political world without it. So I think it is going to take some leadership. It's going to take some pain. It's not something that's going to be fixed overnight. But you can certainly start with the low-hanging fruit. You know, there are large companies, things like Bombardier, the automakers that took billions of dollars and it has not panned out the way they planned, and sort of go from there. I think the interim step, I would say, is the basic price of admission for any taxpayer support is transparency about the terms. Taxpayers get to know what are the terms of the loan, does it get paid back? I think that is the bare minimum that we can start with in terms of being able to see whether these things work or not.
You raise a good point because one of the ways that things become non-transparent is that the federal government formulates these as fully repayable loans unless certain circumstances are not met. So that is to say, if they don't meet certain goals in terms of the growth of the business, then those loans become grants. They are never repaid. Is that part of the issue that you're examining?
Yeah, and I mean, I can think of many examples where, the announcement is made and there's a claim that a certain number of jobs are going to be created, but no one goes back to check. There's no accountability on that. And it's very easy. And I understand the political incentive, and you will as well, having been in office, that it looks very good in a government to be the one riding into town, handing out the money. Everybody's happy. But you need to check if these things work. And if some work and some don't, then it would make sense to not reproduce the ones that don't work. And you can't find any of that out if there's no accountability, no tracking about whether the results actually came in as expected.
Now, I want to have you get out your crystal ball for a moment. We're going to talk about the future, not just the present. Some economists are predicting that there will be a recession at some point. We're obviously not there now. We probably won't be there due to the election cycle in the United States until after the presidential election. But there will be a recession at some point. It could be as early as 2021. How would that affect federal finances and the issues that we're talking about?
Oh, it could be dramatically bad. I mean, the government's already forecasting large deficits and deficit spending, and they'd be blown way off course. So far, the finance minister's response has essentially been, don't worry, be happy. And I don't think a lot of people see that as a very prudent way to prepare for what is an inevitability. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And we do not seem to be doing a very good job, federally of preparing for that.
In terms of what you look at in a federal budget as preparation for when the downturn happens, are you seeing that in federal budgets right now?
Absolutely not. I mean, we're seeing just a sort of don't worry about it attitude, deal with it when it comes. And we haven't seen a narrowing of the deficit over the last few years. Remember, it was supposed to be balanced. Not only are we not balanced, we are still stuck in the $20 billion range. So we're looking at not missing by a little bit, but I mean, they're going to have added within 5 years almost triple what they promised to in terms of debt. It's a significant difference from what they promised.
Do you see that then as the next big challenge in terms of basically federal policy then?
I think so. It may take a little while to get there. I mean, we went through this exercise, more than 25 years ago. So these things go in cycles. I recognize sometimes we're a bit of a lonely voice because some people say deficits don't matter anymore. They do matter. They will matter. The only question is when they're going to start mattering to a critical mass of people.
I want to thank Aaron Wudrick, who is the federal director of the Canadian Taxpayer Federation. Aaron, thank you for joining us on Boom and Bust. We hope to have you back in the future.
Thanks for having me, Tony.
Thank you. And after the break, Boom and Bust is going to tackle the hot button issue of taxation of the rich with Mr. Philip Cross, a former chief economist and analyst at Statistics Canada. Don't go away.
Our government was well positioned to be there for Canadians and lay the groundwork for our economy to bounce back. 4 months later, we've slowed down the progression of the virus significantly, and we're now seeing parts of the economy reopen. And historically low interest rates mean manageable borrowing costs as we continue to invest in Canadians and in the economy. Now, the road to recovery will not be an easy one. Some sectors will bounce back more quickly than others. Some people will be able to find work, but others won't right away. But as we move into this recovery phase, Canadians can count on us to always be in their corner.
Philip Cross, it's great to have you on Boom and Bust again. Welcome.
Thanks for having me back, Tony.
Wanted to guide you to the state of taxation in the Canadian economy and its impact on competitiveness. What are the major principles of Canadian taxation in our economy currently?
We in North America much prefer income taxes to consumption taxes. In Europe, for example, there's a lot of emphasis on value-added taxes, carbon taxes. In North America, however, that's never gone over very well. And in part because of the perceived unfairness of a lot of consumption taxes, like the GST, like carbon taxes, where the burden tends to fall more on lower income people. So we've come to prefer in North America, especially here in Canada, income taxes because they're progressive. That is, that rich people pay more in tax than lower income people. So we collect a lot more of our taxes from income taxes than in Europe. And you see this, for example, in the very sharp resistance to the GST. One reason the Conservatives of your government got elected in 2006 was the promise to cut the GST by 2 points. That was very popular. When we put the GST up for a referendum in BC, people voted it down. So people have a visceral dislike of consumption taxes here in North America. And so as a result, we've come to rely a lot more on income taxes. So that's a big difference between the income tax structure here in North America and that in other parts of the world, notably Europe.
And is that likely to change at all, or is that sort of baked in the bread, as they say?
Oh, I don't think there's. I mean, you saw the reaction of people to the GST. You see how the carbon tax has offended a lot of people. I think there's a very visceral dislike of consumption taxes in this country. People do like income taxes. The problem with income taxes is, though, that people perceive them, that because of their progressivity, people have this idea of, well, let's shift all of the tax burden to the rich. And in fact, you can't do that. You can't do that for two reasons. One, there just aren't enough rich people, especially here in Canada, to meet all the revenue needs of government. And the other is that as you shift the income tax burden more to rich people are very creative in finding ways of minimizing their tax burden. So once you get past 50%, it's very hard for governments to raise significant amounts of revenues with taxes beyond 50%. So yes, you can have a progressive income tax system, but there's a limit to it. And this fantasy that we're just going to have rich people pay all of our taxes and the rest of us will just coast free. No, sorry, that's not going to work as a tax system.
I'm going to switch you then from taxation to the more general overview of the Canadian economy. How are we faring when it comes to productivity and competitiveness vis-a-vis our major trading partners?
Well, vis-a-vis the U.S., which is where 3/4 of our trade goes, we're faring miserably. We really haven't had any productivity growth over the last 10 years. We've had falling business investment. And one of the puzzles, if you remember back in the oil price crash of 2014, the Bank of Canada helped to engineer a very sharp decline in our dollar. It fell from about parity with the US dollar to 75 cents. This was done to give our non-energy exports, especially our manufacturing exports, a big boost. It hasn't happened. And you can see if you follow the Bank of Canada's research closely, they've been scratching their heads and puzzling on why didn't this boost our exports. And a lot of it seems to go back to, yes, we gained a little bit of competitiveness with a lower exchange rate, but meanwhile, we were doing a whole bunch of other things, notably in regulations, notably in our transportation system, not building pipelines to the U.S., for example, notably in increasing taxes, even as the Americans were reducing theirs. We even lost the competitive advantage we used to have in our corporate income tax, that we lost our competitiveness in so many other areas that we never got the bounce in non-energy exports that we were looking for. So it's not just a matter of saying, well, these statistical measures of productivity and competitiveness aren't doing well. The proof is in the pudding, and the pudding is that our manufacturing exports have been going nowhere for 5 years, despite every effort from the Bank of Canada and governments to stimulate them. So something's gone wrong with the model.
Philip Cross, we've run out of time, but I thank you for being on Boom and Bust again, and I look forward to having you back because it is a very important topic for Canada and Canadians. Thank you for being on our program. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Boom and Bust. As you've seen, Canada and the economy of Canada has some very significant issues when it comes to taxation, competitiveness, and productivity. These issues are not going to go away. Our two guests shone some light on it, but this is a topic we will be returning to in later episodes. Again, thank you for joining us at Boom and Bust.